Hello and welcome. So, in this video, I am going to talk all about how to read your chart for your aligned career. So, some of you may already know that I am actually currently putting out an offer where I read your chart to align you with your career. But what I actually wanted to do in this video was to talk about what I look for, what I am looking at in your chart when I am going through somebody's chart to help them to align to their career, to help them understand their strengths, to help them understand how to work, or what ways will work for them in their work, how they relate to money, difficulties they may have, and how you can work through some of these things. So I'm going to get started with that. So, if you have ever read a chart before, then some of this might be familiar already, and if you haven't, then I'll do my best to explain. But you may not necessarily need to know everything, like from, you don't need too much of a foundational understanding, maybe just a little bit, but we'll do what we can. And if you do have any questions, just pop them in the comments, I will respond to them. So, what do I look for in a chart? So there's quite a lot of things, but the first things I tend to look at are the 10th house, the 6th house, and the 2nd house in a chart. So your 10th house is the house of like your, I guess you could call it your career, but it's more like your public life, how you are seen in public. This can be purpose related, although that's North Node stuff as well, but we're not going to get into that right now. So the kind of like overarching vision of what it is that you want to do in the realms of your public life and your work. So this is quite an important house. We also look at the 6th house, which is more the day-to-day of how you work. So it's not so much the big picture, it's more about the sort of day-to-day ways of working. And this is really important to look at in terms of trying to understand how you best work. That is the house I would really look for or look at to try and understand that in somebody else's chart. And then finally, although not really finally, but for this part, the 2nd house is the house of money, of self-worth, of value, of possessions. It's also the house of our voice, which is interesting. But that's a slightly different meaning, and I'm not necessarily looking at it from that perspective unless somebody's voice is relevant to their work, and I might look at that. So these are kind of the first 3 things I sort of look at generally, although it depends on what's jumping out at me as well, but these are the kind of main areas I'm looking at, and I'm looking at other things as well, but we'll come on to that in a minute. So when I'm looking at these houses, what I first generally look at is what this house is ruled by in your chart. So for example, the 10th house is normally ruled by Capricorn, but it may not be Capricorn in your chart. You may have a Cancer like rulership of the 10th house, which would make you a Libra rising, like me. Or I would generally, so I would look at what astrological sign rules that house. And that gives me a lot of information around what kind of work you would feel most satisfied with, what kind of ways you like to work as well. So I would kind of be looking at like the career, like when I'm looking at the 10th house, the sign that it's in, so Aries or Capricorn or whatever it may be, will help me determine what kind of needs you have in your career. So for example, if your 10th house was ruled by Aries, that would be someone who probably would like to work quite independently, someone who wants to work in a more fast-paced way, someone who doesn't mean independent as in like no team, but someone who is maybe the leader, like someone who wants to lead. It can be quite good for people who maybe are quite entrepreneurial if they have an Aries 10th house. This doesn't mean that if you don't have Aries 10th house that you shouldn't be an entrepreneur. That's not what I mean. Really important that that's said actually, because there's other parts of your chart that could indicate that. But yeah, so it kind of gives you a sense of what somebody would be fulfilled by based on the sign. And then I would do the same thing with the sixth house. I'd do the same thing with the second house. So again, what sign rules that house? What does that kind of mean for that house? Obviously, it would take me forever to go through every single meaning, but that's what I'm looking for. So what sign is it in? And then I'll look at what planets are in those houses, if there are any. So sometimes you may have no planets, sometimes you may have loads of planets. If there's no planets, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no information. There's still quite a lot you can get from that. But certainly the planets will give more sort of information on top. So again, like if you were looking at the 10th house and you saw that the moon was in there, that would give it a certain meaning. It would also mean the moon is in Aries, so your moon is in Aries, if that makes sense. Using Aries as an example again, which would have a different signature to say moon in Cancer, right? Moon in Cancer has different needs, which is kind of what the moon represents, is our emotional needs, our inner needs, what helps us to feel sort of emotionally fulfilled. So moon placement can be important to look at as well, but we'll come to that in a minute. And yeah, so, and then also with it being in the 10th house, like that could indicate that someone having like a career is quite important to them in terms of like feeling emotionally fulfilled. So that's like one example. So I would look at all the different planets that are in there and what they kind of give in terms of more information. I also look at the planetary ruler of that house and where that is in the chart. So let's use Aries as an example again for the 10th house. Aries planetary ruler is Mars. So I would see which house Mars is in, and that would also give me some more information around what might be satisfying for them in terms of their career, a different house to look at. So for instance, if Mars was in the 8th house, because Mars is the ruler of the 10th house and it's in the 8th house, that would be someone like that. Well, the 8th house rules like joint ventures. It also rules the occult, psychology, death, all very Scorpio themes, because Scorpio rules the 8th house. So that could also give you more information around, you know, what might be suitable for them in terms of a career or like a role that they could do. So if they don't entirely resonate with everything in the 10th house, that might be why, because there's stuff going on in the 8th house that wants to be expressed in the career. So that's the kind of thing I'd look for. And again, I would do the same things in the other houses. So I'd look at the 6th house, I would look at what planets are in there. That would give me an indication of how somebody works. So for instance, if you had Pisces in your 6th house, that's me, that for me like shows up as needing to be quite flexible in my schedule, not having like a really, really strict routine. Pisces doesn't love lots of like rigidity. It's like the two fish swimming in the opposite direction. So and that's very true for me. I like a lot of fluidity and a lot of flexibility. Of course there are things that go in my diary, but I am quite fluid in how I work, and something that's too structured would not be fulfilling or satisfying for me and wouldn't work very well for me. So that, again, that's the sign that it's in. And then if there were any planets there, I would also see how that shows up. So for instance, if you had Jupiter in the 6th house, just again to give an example, Jupiter often, wherever Jupiter is, tends to be where you have luck. So you might have a lot of luck getting jobs, right? That could be how that shows up. So someone who finds it quite easy to get work. I know someone with Jupiter in the 6th house, this is very true for them. And it's also in Sagittarius, which is the rulership of Jupiter. So it's really shows up in their chart. So yeah, so that's just again another example. And once again, I would look at the ruler of the 6th house. So again, if we're using Pisces as the example of the sign of that 6th house, Pisces ruler has two rulers, it's Jupiter and Neptune. I would probably look more at Neptune. I think that's kind of like, well, you can look at both certainly, but I look more at Neptune. And then I would see which house Neptune is in. So again, using my own chart just to kind of illustrate this point, I know that my 6th house is Pisces, Neptune is in my 4th house, and that kind of could indicate someone who likes to work from home. The 4th house is the house of home. That's very much exactly where I am right now. I'm in my home. I get a lot of inspiration from my home. That's Neptune, right? Neptune is all about inspiration. I'm very inspired to work in my home. Like I get a lot of inspiration from the space that I'm in. So again, that's kind of something that might be quite helpful to understand in terms of like where the planetary ruler is and what house it's in, and how that could also feed into the way you work, right? The way I work is often from home, and I love that. That works really well for me. But somebody else might not enjoy that at all, right? So that's the kind of thing I'd be looking for. And then once again, I would look at the second house, do the same kind of thing. So again, let's say it's ruled by Scorpio, which is mine. So look at the rulership, like which sign it's in Scorpio. And then again, that would give me an idea of like how I work with money, and any planets that are in that house as well. And then the ruler of Scorpio is also got a let me start that again. Planetary ruler of Scorpio is Mars and it's Pluto, and I would see where Mars and Pluto are and how that might show up in terms of how I want to make money, and like the best ways for me to make money and how I like to make money. So they're kind of like a really quick overview of like sort of what I'm looking at to start with. And then obviously like that requires understanding what the planets are about, that requires understanding the signs and how that shows up in the context of the houses. So understanding all of these three different kind of elements and then bringing it all together. I would also look to see how well placed these planets are and the like signs they're in. So for instance, again, using my own chart just to kind of illustrate the point, is like I know, so in the second house, my moon is in Scorpio. So the moon is in my second house, which indicates it's quite important for me to make money. Like it's important for me to have, it's important for me to feel like safe and secure financially. Like that's something that is true for me. I do feel that's quite important. But with it being in Scorpio, the moon, so the moon, the planet itself, is in its fall in Scorpio, and it doesn't do super well there, so it might create some problems. And I have had problems, you know, in the past. And I also have Pluto in the second house of the planetary ruler. Hopefully I'm not losing you at this point. I know it's a lot. Is in the second house, and that can create a lot of change and transformation and upheaval, which again I have seen in my life of cycles where you may have lots of money and then lose money, and that's a thing. So it's not a death sentence, it's just something to help me understand how I can overcome that, right? And that's something that empowers me by understanding that. And again, someone else may not have any sort of planets that are in their fall or their detriment. They might be in a really helpful place, it might be exalted, or it might be in its domicile, which would be in really strong positions. And then that's also something to understand in terms of how you can capitalize on those things. So hopefully that makes sense so far. And that's in and of itself tells you an awful lot of information. And then what I also look for, so it's helpful to sort of understand the top three as well. So that's your sun, moon, and rising. I particularly look at the rising because the rising is the sign that you are, let me start that again. So the rising is what we are motivated by. It's also how we appear to other people and what people may perceive us as. But I think of it also as like what drives us, right? So that can be really helpful in terms of your career, of like how that can weave in there. That might be quite relevant in terms of like what we are motivated by is indicated by our rising sign. It can also be indicated by our Mars as well. So I might look to where Mars is, because Mars is what we're driven by or what gives us energy. So Mars can be quite helpful to look at too. Mars may be in one of those three houses, but if he's not, I might look to see where he is as well. But generally I look more at the rising, and that gives me quite a lot of information. So again, what sign is it in? Is it Aries rising? Is it Taurus rising, etc.? And that will help me. So then I think about the planetary ruler of that sign. So again, if it was Taurus, I know that Taurus's planetary ruler is Venus. So someone's going to be quite motivated or driven by beauty and maybe comfort, because it's more Taurus's sort of domain is comfort and stability. So someone if they're Taurus rising, they probably want and crave stability and crave kind of like luxury, and that being quite important to them. So again, that might be somebody who wants like a lot of money so that they can create the luxurious life that they want, whereas somebody else might not care about that, right? So it can really give you some good information there in terms of like what your rising sign could tell you about how that can fit in with your career in terms of what drives you and what inspires you. Not so much inspires, but drives you. Okay, so rising sign is what I would also look at. And then, yeah, the moon. Again, I like to look at the moon. So I say rising first is generally what I look at. And this is just me. This is just my method. You don't have to do it this way. It's certainly, it's up to you. But generally that's how I look at it. And the moon, because again, that's our emotional needs. So like can our career fulfill our emotional needs? It doesn't have to, by the way. It's completely okay for some people if their career doesn't fulfill them emotionally, because another arena in their life might do that. It could be their relationships, it could be their children, it could be, their passion, like hobbies, right? So I don't want to say it has to, but it can, with somebody who has a lot of 10th house placements. That would indicate somebody who probably is quite interested in their career and it is quite important to them. So I might look at their moon to give more information of what like their emotional needs are and how their career could sort of, complement that. So that's something else I might look at. And then I'd say probably the last thing I look at, although again, like every chart is different and I do allow myself to be pulled in intuitively, right? Sometimes something's just looking at me and I'm like, that feels really significant and it's just calling me, right? So that there is that. But other than the intuitive part, I tend to also look at stelliums. So a stellium is when you have 3 or more planets or points in a chart. Now I look at stelliums from like there is some debate around this. I think that pretty much anything counts as a planet or a point. So things like your north node could count. Some people don't count it if it's not a planet, because your north node and south node aren't planets, but I do count them personally. I also count your midheaven. We've not talked about that yet. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I also count like Chiron, which is like a minor planet, because I think they're all quite significant still. But some people say it has to be the kind of like 7 planets, like Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, and the other one, which I forgot. I don't know what I've said. But anyway, the kind of inner planets, right? Some people think it's more that. And maybe the outer planets to some degree, but not so much the points and the nodes and stuff. So that's what I look at. So if there's any houses that have a stellium where they have 3 or more of these things, then that's probably quite important to that person. That any stelliums is quite a significant part of somebody's chart. Now, someone might not have any stelliums, so that's fine. But if they do, then I tend to look at that as well. And again, I would look at what sign it's in, what planets they are, what house it is, and how this might connect to their career. Now, sometimes what you find is that when you're looking at, say, the 10th, 6th and 2nd house, this is certainly what happens to me a lot, that you get pointed to a different house. So let's say, for example, like you look at the 10th house and you see that the planetary ruler is Mars, right? We talked about at the beginning, and that's in the 8th house. So I'm looking at the 8th house. So things kind of direct you to a certain house. And that may be a stellium. So that can be interesting as well. So it's like, okay, so that's giving us more information around what's important to this person outside of their career, but does fit in with their career. So again, if something kept pointing me to the 8th house, I'd be like, maybe this person wants to work in psychology or like helping people with grief, or working in the occult sciences, or working, like having joint ventures with people, and that being important in terms of how they work. So that's something I would also look at as well. So whether it's a stellium or if something keeps pointing me to another house that's outside of the 10th, 6th and the 2nd. So that's a very quick, down and dirty kind of overview of how I look at a chart when I'm deciphering what would be helpful for someone for their to understand their career, like what could align them to their career, how to work with their strengths and talents, and what direction they could look to go in if they're feeling a bit stuck or feeling like I'm working in things and I'm just not really interested in it anymore and I don't really know where to go, I would say that looking at your chart for career like can be so unbelievably helpful. Like I know for me, when I look at my own chart, I'm like, yeah, like that feels so aligned now because I've aligned myself to my chart a lot more. I've like paid attention to like we talked about the Pisces in the 6th house. It's like, yeah, it's important for me to not have jobs that are too rigid, and I pay attention to that a lot now, and I make sure that I'm not in situations like that that are too rigid anymore. So this is why I really love to look at charts in this way, because work is such a big part of our lives. Even if it's not the most important thing to you, the majority of us do have to work, right? So it's like trying to find a way to make it work for you best so that you can have a better time doing it, because it is such a huge majority of our time. And that's why I love to look at charts for this reason, because it's just such a huge area. So if that is something that really speaks to you and you want to go deeper and you want to book in with me around that, hopefully you found this helpful, and that'll give you some stuff to work on yourself if you want to. But if you do want to go deeper, all of the information of how you can work with me is in the description below. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment, or you can email me at info@themoonlightoracle.co.uk. If you have any questions and you don't want to leave it in the comments, that's completely fine. And yeah, I really hope that helped, and that sort of helped to illuminate some things and mysteries around how to look at your chart for your career. So thank you so much for watching that. And as always, if you have enjoyed it, liking, commenting, subscribing is the best way to support the channel. Or you could share it with somebody as well. That really helps support the channel and hopefully helps support them too, if this is something that they want to understand better when looking at their own chart. So thank you so much. Mwah.